Dawn rose slowly over Leyte on a late October morning in 1944, its first light filtering through a canopy so dense that day and night blurred into the same muted green. The air hung heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. In this silence, thick, unmoving, almost watchful, American Rangers advanced along the narrow ridges that cut through the island's interior. They expected small pockets of resistance, the fading remnants of a retreating garrison. But the jungle, indifferent and impenetrable, offered no hint of what waited ahead. Moving in staggered columns, the Rangers stepped carefully between roots and slick stones, their boots sinking into the damp soil. The terrain forced them into single-file paths that curved like veins through the hills, granting little room to maneuver. Yet their confidence held. Intelligence had suggested scattered defenders, men without supplies, withdrawing toward the coast. It was supposed to be a simple push, a chance to tighten the American foothold before the main advance resumed. The first burst of fire shattered that assumption. It came from three directions at once, sharp, disciplined cracks that tore through foliage and sent splinters of bark into the air. Rangers dropped instinctively, pressed against the earth as rounds sliced overhead. Within seconds, more fire joined in, machine guns, then rifles, then grenades whose concussions rolled through the jungle like muted thunder. It took only moments for the truth to settle in. They had not stumbled into a skirmish. They had walked into a trap carefully set by an enemy who knew the terrain and had been waiting for exactly this moment. The ridgelines around them erupted with movement as Japanese infantry closed in, forming a tightening ring of rifles and bayonets. Radio reports crackled through the din, each one confirming what the men already sensed. Nearly 1,000 Japanese troops were converging on their position. The Rangers' line wavered, scattering under the initial shock, yet their discipline, honed through months of brutal fighting, held firm enough to prevent collapse. Amid the chaos, a single voice carried over the gunfire. The platoon leader spoke quietly, without urgency or fear, as though stating a simple fact rather than issuing an order. "We hold here." And in that moment, shock gave way to something steadier, because none of them yet knew that this stand was only the beginning of a far greater storm. As the first light of morning deepened into a humid, oppressive brightness, American commanders assessed the situation with grim clarity. Withdrawal was impossible. Every ridge, every narrow path, funneled them toward the waiting ring of Japanese forces. Any attempt to pull back would invite disaster, turning cautious survival into a slaughter. The decision, though unspoken, was immediate. They would stand. There was no alternative. A quick check of ammunition revealed the precarious reality. Each Ranger carried enough for minutes, not hours, of sustained combat. Magazines were counted and recounted, each round precious, each bullet a potential lifeline. The knowledge did not paralyze them, it sharpened their focus. Every movement, every position would have to be precise. Survival was no longer about numbers, it was about skill, discipline, and timing. The jungle around them seemed to conspire with the enemy. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, fragmenting the air into shafts of green and gold. Sound twisted in the dense foliage, gunfire bouncing back like 1,000 voices calling from every direction. The echoes disoriented even the most experienced men, turning what should have been clear warning shots into a confusion of phantom threats. Despite the uncertainty, the Rangers lowered themselves to one knee, rifles trained, eyes scanning, minds steeled. They prepared for a fight they understood might claim most of them. There was a quiet resolve in their movements, a rhythm born of months of training and the harsh lessons of earlier campaigns. Death was close, but so was courage, each feeding the other. From all sides, the Japanese tightened their encirclement, moving with a confidence born of superior numbers and tactical patience. Their presence pressed the Americans into smaller pockets, forcing each man to confront the enemy at distances measured in yards rather than meters. And then it happened, a single misfire on the Japanese side. The sharp report cut through the layered echoes of the jungle like a bell breaking hesitation into action. In an instant, the quiet tension erupted into a violent, close-range confrontation. What followed was a test of everything the Rangers had been trained for. Rapid targeting, disciplined fire, the silent communication of experienced squads. Every decision, every breath, measured the fine line between life and death. And yet, even as the first volleys tore through the ridges, no one could know that these 30 minutes would define the immense of endurance, courage, and resolve in the battles to come. As smoke from gunfire and grenades coiled through the trees, shouted orders became meaningless. The crackle of rifles, the impact of rounds on foliage and the muffled screams blended into a singular roar. Commanders lowered their voices to hand signals, gestures swift and precise, each motion carrying weight measured in survival. In that haze, clarity came not from sound but from sight. A raised fist, a pointed finger, the tilt of a helmeted head directing the deadly ballet unfolding among the ridges. Rangers adjusted instantly, shifting from rapid volleys to controlled, deliberate bursts. Each bullet was accounted for, each discharge a potential life saved or lost. They fired in measured rhythms, targeting only what was necessary, turning the art of shooting into a science. Amid the relentless advance of the Japanese, who surged forward in disciplined formations bred for aggression, these pauses, these deliberate shots, began to dictate the tempo of the engagement. Every foot of ground became contested. American fire, disciplined and methodical, reshaped the line slowly but inexorably. The jungle ridges, once mere obstacles, became instruments of defense. The enemy's momentum, formidable at first, faltered against carefully chosen fields of fire, yet the cost was evident. Casualties mounted on both sides, men fell silently, their absence measured in the shifting gaps along the line, but a subtle change began to emerge. The tide, once threatening to sweep them away, hesitated. From vantage points carefully chosen in the jungle, commanders observed the battle as one might read a living map. Patterns of movement, lines of sight, and the natural choke points of the ridges revealed an unexpected truth. The terrain, once a confining cage, could be wielded as an advantage. Each ridge, each cluster of palms, each narrow path became a tool of survival, a lever to hold back the larger force. A quiet, almost imperceptible understanding passed among the leaders. Escape might no longer be possible, the odds still heavily against them. Yet the same terrain that seemed to threaten annihilation offered a path to victory. The Rangers had learned the first lesson of true combat, that courage, discipline, and knowledge of one's ground could bend even overwhelming numbers to the will of those who refused to yield. And in that moment, a fragile hope took root amidst the smoke and chaos, one that would carry them into the next chapter of the battle. In the command posts scattered across Leyte's northern ridges, Japanese officers reviewed maps and dispatches with a quiet certainty born of habit and history. It was late 1944, and the Imperial Army had long relied on doctrine that prized numbers above all else. Strength in mass, the belief that overwhelming forces could break even the steadiest defenders, was ingrained into every plan, every movement, and every expectation of victory. Confidence was not assumed, it was institutionalized. Officers believed that small American units, when confronted from multiple angles, would inevitably falter. This assumption shaped every tactic on the island. Over years of fighting, encounters with isolated squads and reconnaissance teams had reinforced the pattern. When outflanked, they observed, the Americans hesitated, sometimes collapsed. These lessons, etched into the mindset of men who had endured campaigns from China to the Solomons, guided decisions with a mix of doctrine and hubris. Plans for Leyte emphasized the kind of aggression that Japanese commanders had long valued. Bayonet charges, massed infantry movements, and tightly coordinated formations were considered decisive. Speed and weight of attack, rather than subtlety or maneuver, were prioritized. Every scout report that reached the command posts was filtered through this lens of expectation. A single enemy squad, caught alone, would not survive. On the morning of the Leyte engagement, scouts reported precisely that. A small American element navigating the jungle ridges. To the Japanese officers, this confirmed the narrative they already held. There was no caution, only the anticipation of victory. The encirclement was drawn not merely to eliminate a tactical threat, but to reinforce a moral principle. Discipline and numbers, when applied with precision, would humiliate and dominate. It was a lesson, they believed, meant to be delivered in the brutal calculus of battlefield consequence. This confidence extended into the minutiae of the plan. Units were positioned to pressure the Americans from every ridge, every knoll, every gap the jungle allowed. Timing was synchronized, movement rehearsed, and retreat paths anticipated to leave no avenue unblocked. In this design, there was no room for error and little recognition of the unpredictability of human will. Past triumphs against smaller forces had blinded them to the possibility of disciplined resistance. They assumed at the shock of encirclement would produce panic, disarray, and surrender. Every officer, every platoon leader carried the belief that sheer weight of numbers would be sufficient to dominate the ridge lines. The plan was as much about psychological submission as physical destruction. To break the men in front of them was to affirm the doctrine itself. Yet beneath this confidence lay a vulnerability invisible to the Japanese command. Numbers alone cannot dictate courage, skill, or resolve. The very officers who trusted in mass underestimated the subtle influence of terrain, the calculation of experienced defenders, and the quiet, stubborn will of those who refused to yield. By the time the first volleys struck the ridges, this hubris would meet its test. A test the Japanese had not anticipated, and one that would shape the fate of the battle in ways no map or doctrine could foresee. And as the encirclement tightened, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the very assumptions of numerical supremacy. American Rangers approached the Leyte Ridges not as raw recruits, but as soldiers forged in the crucible of earlier campaigns across North Africa and Europe. Their doctrine was born of hard lessons: swift action, decentralized command, and an unyielding reliance on initiative. The men had learned that rigid adherence to orders could be fatal in chaotic terrain, and that survival often depended on the judgment of individuals, not the marching of bureaucratic strategy. Each ranger carried this understanding into the dense Philippine jungle, where uncertainty would test it like never before. Small unit independence was not merely a principle, it was a lifeline. Patrols of a dozen men could hold positions that would have overwhelmed conventional platoons. Rapid decision-making was ingrained into every training exercise, every live-fire drill. A single squad could observe, react, and strike in ways that confounded larger forces, shifting momentum with the quiet precision of practiced hands. Fire and maneuver tactics became instinct, the coordinated alternation between suppressive fire and movement, allowing even a handful of men to dictate the terms of engagement. Veterans recognized the rhythm of the enemy before them. Patterns of Japanese assault, mass charges, coordinated flanking, reliance on bayonet shock were familiar from prior skirmishes and intelligence reports. These rangers did not assume infallibility. They recognized a battlefield pattern and understood how to counter it. Their preparation was clinical, almost mathematical. Terrain assessed, likely avenues of approach noted, kill zones established with a meticulous patience that belied the chaos of gunfire. Belief in this context was not arrogance. It was the quiet confidence born of preparation, of repeated exposure to danger, and the understanding that competence could outweigh numbers. Leaders reminded their men that victory was seldom a product of luck, and never of bravado. Clarity under pressure was the true measure of combat effectiveness. Decisions, even when executed under the roar of rifles and the explosion of grenades, were deliberate, precise, and rooted in practice. As the battle unfolded, that clarity became the Rangers' only stable element. The smoke, the echoes, the shifting canopy, all threatened to disorient and unnerve. Yet within each squad, a sense of control persisted. Movement, fire discipline, and mutual awareness created a fragile order within the chaos, a rhythm that kept panic at bay. It was this order, invisible to the enemy, that transformed confusion into opportunity. The Japanese pressed with confidence born of doctrine and habit, yet they confronted soldiers who had learned to make the impossible routine. Every ridge, every cluster of palms, every narrow defile became a proving ground for this doctrine, and the Rangers' calm, deliberate application of skill slowly began to erode the assumptions of the encircling force. By the time the first full wave of the assault reached their positions, the Rangers were not invincible, but they were ready. And in that quiet, disciplined preparedness lay the seed of resilience, the first glimmer of hope that, in a battle defined by numbers, it would be clarity, not mass, that might determine survival. In the smoke-filled ridges of Leyte, preparation became their only certainty, and the measure by which all else would be tested. Leyte's jungle was a labyrinth of ridges and ravines, each narrow path twisting unpredictably beneath the dense canopy. Sunlight struggled through the intertwined leaves, casting fractured patterns across the forest floor. Visibility was limited to a few meters. Sound, distorted by the thick vegetation, returned as echoing whispers or phantom threats. Every step demanded attention, every glance measured against the possibility of unseen adversaries. In this tangled green, the battlefield itself seemed alive, indifferent yet demanding respect. Japan's doctrine, honed in open fields and coastal approaches, emphasized aggressive forward movement. Their officers relied on momentum, confidence, and the massed shock of troops to overwhelm defenders. Choke points, narrow angles, and restrictive terrain were antithetical to their methods. They expected to press the Americans back with relentless pressure, forcing small units to fracture beneath coordinated assaults. The jungle, they believed, would simply be an obstacle to negotiate rather than a weapon in itself. For the Rangers, the compressed battlefield played to their strengths. Narrow ridges and hidden corners allowed small squads to establish kill zones, to deliver fire in controlled, overlapping arcs. Each slope, each bend in the path became a tool. Movement through these constricted spaces amplified skill and discipline while mitigating the advantage of superior numbers. In the hands of a unit trained for initiative and precision, the jungle was no longer an obstacle. It was an ally. At the outset, both sides carried the illusion of advantage. The Japanese believed their sheer numbers would force a collapse. The Americans counted on training and preparation to turn the terrain into a force multiplier. For hours, each engaged the other under these assumptions, unaware of the subtle ways the jungle would shape the battle. Gradually, the bias of the terrain became evident. Ridges funneled advancing troops into predictable lines of fire. Ravines concealed defensive positions, allowing Rangers to strike and withdraw without exposing themselves. The natural choke points favored careful calculation over brute force, rewarding patience and coordination while punishing reckless advancement. Numbers, once the measure of power, began to lose meaning against disciplined, methodical resistance. American squads recognized the shift first. Adjustments were made instinctively. Formations tightened, fire and maneuver tactics exploited every angle, and overlapping fields of fire were recalculated with each fallen tree or shifting slope. Commanders communicated silently, gestures replacing words, ensuring that the environment was leveraged at every opportunity. The battlefield, once assumed neutral, now served them. Meanwhile, Japanese forces continued their advance, confident in the doctrines that had served them elsewhere. They moved forward with momentum, unaware that each ridge, each narrow defile, constrained their options and funneled them toward lethal lines of fire. The jungle, impartial yet deliberate, had chosen a side, and the Americans, disciplined and observant, were beginning to see the advantage it offered them, an advantage that would soon redefine the battle entirely. The first coordinated push from the Japanese came as a wave that seemed endless. Hundreds of rifles, bayonets, and the muted thunder of light machine guns pressed forward along the ridges. Their advance was confident, rehearsed, a textbook application of doctrine honed in countless campaigns across the Pacific. Every squad moved in rhythm with the others, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets angled, eyes fixed on the shadowed American positions ahead. To an observer, it was the embodiment of momentum, the calculated pressure of numbers against terrain. The Rangers, however, were not waiting to be crushed. They had trained for situations precisely like this, where discipline and calculation could counter the seeming inevitability of mass. Each squad fired in slow, deliberate patterns, measured bursts designed to halt momentum without wasting ammunition. Rifle reports cracked like metronomes through the jungle. Each shot was aimed, each volley synchronized with its neighbor, carefully calibrated to disrupt formation, not merely inflict casualties. Where chaos reigned for the Japanese, order reigned for the Americans. The technical advantages of the Rangers' weapons magnified this effect. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic and robust, allowed each rifleman to deliver 8 rounds before a quick, almost reflexive reload. The Browning automatic rifle, the bar, delivered suppressive fire that could pin advancing squads without requiring a second shooter. These weapons, balanced with the men's discipline, transformed the ridges into interlocking zones of lethal precision. Every shot counted, every movement synchronized with its neighbor. By contrast, the Japanese infantry relied on Arisaka rifles and light machine guns optimized for mid-range, open-field combat. In the confines of the jungle ridges, their weapons were slow to cycle, cumbersome to maneuver, and ill-suited to the close angles that the terrain demanded. The dense foliage disrupted the arcs of fire, and the narrow ridges prevented the massed formations from bringing their weight to bear. What worked in wide valleys and beaches faltered against concealment, surprise, and methodical opposition. Rangers shifted instinctively into interlocking fields of fire, a tactic perfected in European campaigns. Each squad overlapped with its neighbor, creating zones where Japanese soldiers, pressed together, became easy targets for the controlled, sequential volleys. Hidden behind trees, fallen logs, and concealed slopes, these kill zones were almost invisible until a soldier stepped into them, and then the jungle erupted. The enemy's advance was no longer a force. It was a trap, a series of deadly corridors engineered by skill and patience rather than size. Amid the chaos, the Japanese misinterpreted what they saw. Controlled, measured volleys seemed to their eyes like evidence of exhaustion, of men running low on ammunition, of a line beginning to crack. Confidence, which had carried them this far, now faltered. They pressed forward, doubling down on momentum, unaware that every step forward was a step into the carefully orchestrated discipline of the Rangers. The cost of this miscalculation was immediate and brutal. Hundreds of Japanese troops fell into the hidden patterns of fire, their bodies marking the precise intervals where skill outweighed weight. Each ridge became a ledger of overconfidence, each grove a testament to the lethal advantage of preparation. The initial wave stalled, and then, staggered, it collapsed under the methodical resistance of a force many times smaller but far more coordinated. By the end of the engagement, the lesson was clear. In a battlefield where chaos is assumed, control becomes the deadliest weapon. Numbers alone could not force the jungle's will, and aggression, misread as weakness, could lead to annihilation. The Rangers, disciplined and patient, had turned terrain, weaponry, and experience into a singular instrument of survival. And yet, as the smoke began to rise from the ridges, neither side could foresee that the next innovation, arriving silently and unseen, would soon challenge the very principles that had defined this brutal calculus. The first Japanese officers to notice the unraveling of their formations paused briefly, surveying a battlefield that refused to conform to doctrine. Casualties mounted at rates far higher than expected. Units that had been trained for coordinated, aggressive assaults were now reduced to fragmented groups, scattered across the ridges. The officers' confidence, once unshakable, wavered as reports of dead and wounded flowed back through the lines. In the shadowed jungle, discipline collided with chaos, and the theoretical strength of numbers faltered under the unyielding resistance of a well-prepared few. In response, the Japanese pivoted toward flanking maneuvers, sending squads up the steep, forested ridges surrounding the main engagement. Their intent was clear: to break the Rangers' line through elevation, to force a collapse from above. Every squad moved quickly, aware that speed and surprise were their only remaining advantages. Yet in compressing the battlefield into these constrained approaches, they played into the very strengths the Americans had cultivated for months of jungle warfare. The Rangers anticipated these movements with quiet precision. Elevated positions were reinforced, overlapping fields of fire recalculated, and angles chosen to intercept the flanking attempts before they could reach the main line. Every motion was deliberate, every weapon trained to maximize effect while conserving ammunition. In these moments, small groups of men became a living, reactive instrument, adjusting in real time to counter enemy innovation with experience and intellect. Supply lines, tenuous as they were, held under pressure. Ammunition runners crawled through the underbrush, often within yards of advancing Japanese patrols, keeping each position armed and ready. Their work was silent and methodical. The life of the line depended on their endurance as much as on the marksmanship of the riflemen. Each magazine delivered, each round counted, was a small act of survival threading through the chaos of combat. Amid the smoke and the intermittent roar of gunfire, a Ranger medic established a triage point under the canopy, the ground trembling with the impact of nearby rounds. The medic worked with precision and calm, patching wounds, directing evacuation of the wounded, and stabilizing men who would otherwise have fallen. Each action was a quiet defiance of the surrounding violence, a commitment to the principle that no man would be left unassisted, even as the enemy pressed closer. Leadership adapted with the rhythm of the battlefield. Officers who fell to the Japanese rifle or machine gun were replaced instantly by sergeants or junior commanders, their decisions seamless, their judgment tested by fire and experience. Hierarchy became fluid. Authority was a matter of necessity and competence rather than rank alone. This adaptability ensured that despite the relentless pressure, the Rangers remained coordinated, disciplined, and resilient. In these conditions, innovation became the true weapon. Each adjustment, whether in positioning, timing, or fire discipline, was an intellectual act as much as a tactical one. Survival was no longer determined by sheer physicality or the weight of numbers. It became a test of ingenuity, observation, and the ability to respond to the unforeseen. In the heart of Lety's ridges, the Rangers demonstrated that a force guided by clarity, flexibility, and foresight could bend the battlefield itself to its will. And as Japanese flanking squads faltered against unseen fields of fire, as runners delivered ammunition through the thickets, and medics tended the wounded under the canopy's shadow, it became evident that this battle would be decided not by doctrine or dogma, but by the disciplined intellect of those who could adapt faster than their opponent. Yet even in these moments of mastery, a new variable was approaching, unseen, that threatened to rewrite the rules entirely. The jungle ridges of Leyte compressed the battle into a series of hollow spaces, narrow clearings where the Rangers and Japanese were forced into close quarters. Here, every decision carried weight measured in life and death. The fighting became intimate, almost surgical. A misjudged step or a delayed trigger could spell disaster. Men were forced to act not as part of a mass, but as individuals whose choices determined not only their survival, but that of their comrades pressed beside them. Visibility shrank to mere feet as smoke missed, and the jungle canopy enveloped the combatants. The Japanese pressed forward relentlessly, their bayonets gleaming briefly as they advanced, their eyes fixed on breaking the American line. At times, it was impossible to distinguish friend from foe in the dim, green-filtered light. Rangers had to rely on discipline and familiarity with their squad to prevent chaos, turning split-second perception into a weapon. Acts of restraint became as crucial as acts of aggression. In the tight corridors of the ridges, a rifle fired a fraction too early could strike a comrade. A hand grenade misjudged could devastate the line. Yet the men held, measured their responses, and trusted one another implicitly. Each controlled reaction was a small triumph over the instinctive violence that surrounded them, a testament to training and mutual reliance forged in campaigns across North Africa and Europe. A brief lull settled over the ridge, almost unnatural in its quiet. The roar of gunfire faded to distant echoes, and the men felt the strain of hours compressed into moments of extreme intensity. Exhaustion crept into every joint and sinew, a creeping weight that threatened to erode focus. Yet even in fatigue, the Rangers drew strength from their cohesion. Belief in one another, the shared understanding that every man would act to protect his neighbor, anchored morale and held the line steady. Across the hollow spaces, Japanese troops pulled back, regrouping for what would be the final, overwhelming assault. Their discipline remained, but the previous waves had taught them a costly lesson. This was not an enemy that would break under weight alone. They adjusted, forming new attack angles, coordinating charges meant to exploit every perceived weakness. The forest seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the convergence of opposing wills. In those tense moments, every ranger knew the battlefield was approaching a pivot point. The hollow spaces, the ridges, the interlocking fields of fire, all of it would coalesce into a decisive moment. Every heartbeat carried the weight of what was to come, every glance carried understanding. The battle would turn on the precision of their actions, the discipline of their fire, and the courage that tempered instinct. And as the Japanese advanced once more, the men readied themselves, bodies tense, minds sharp, hearts steady. They had survived the first waves, adapted under fire, and trusted each other in the smoke-filled ridges. Now all that remained was to meet the final surge, to seize the moment when preparation, clarity, and courage would converge to define the outcome of the engagement. In the hollow spaces of Leyte, the stage was set for the instant that would decide survival, honor, and the calculus of life itself. As the morning stretched into an oppressive, humid noon, Japanese commanders resolved to commit everything to a single, decisive act, a full bayonet charge. Years of training, doctrine, and the belief in the crushing power of mass converged into one final, overwhelming wave. Orders were shouted through officers, whistles and barked commands, the rhythm of preparation echoing through the dense jungle. Every soldier understood the task: advance, break the line, and humiliate the Americans whose resistance had so far defied expectation. The jungle itself seemed to tremble under the collective movement of hundreds of men. Branches snapped, leaves tore, and the dull pounding of boots struck against the uneven earth like a primitive drum. Shouts, whistles, and the guttural cries of advancing troops created a single, relentless roar that filled the air and reverberated along the ridges. The sheer volume of sound was meant to intimidate, to compel hesitation, but the Rangers did not falter. They held their positions, silent and still, rifles trained on the advancing forms. Each man waited with a quiet patience born of experience and preparation, knowing that to fire too early would squander both ammunition and opportunity. Time slowed in those tense moments. The Japanese closed the distance, oblivious to the trap they were entering. The forest, with its narrow ridges and concealed angles, amplified the deadly calculus, concentrating the charge into predictable paths that the Americans had already measured and covered. At 20 yards, the line opened fire. Rifle reports rang sharp and precise. The M1 Garan's semi-automatic fire cut through the advancing ranks, while the bars laid down suppressive arcs that pinned waves of men against the ridges. The effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese formations, once confident in their momentum, shattered as individuals fell in succession. The massed advance collapsed under a storm of controlled, disciplined fire, turning the offensive into a chaotic retreat across the smoke-filled slopes. Yet the jungle's twists and folds allowed small groups to slip through. They surged forward in brief, disjointed pushes, exploiting any gap that appeared in the line. The battle transitioned seamlessly into hand-to-hand fighting along the entire perimeter. Bayonets clashed, knives struck, and the impact of combat became intimate, tactile, and brutal. Every ranger was tested in split-second decisions where hesitation could cost life, and every Japanese soldier who reached the line became a confrontation measured in inches and instincts rather than yards and doctrine. Even in this chaos, the Americans' discipline held. The ridge became a series of interlocking positions, each man aware of his neighbor, each squad covering adjacent angles. They adapted fluidly to penetration attempts, sealing gaps and delivering counterattacks where necessary. The combination of desperation and preparation transformed the final push from a simple assault into a trial of intellect and nerve. Where numbers once promised dominance, only clarity, timing, and cohesion determined survival. By the time the sun had crested fully, the Japanese final push had met a defense forged in equal parts courage and experience. The wave of aggression, meant to sweep away the American line, was broken. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the ridge remained in Ranger hands. What had been anticipated as a moment of collapse had instead crystallized into a demonstration of discipline overcoming weight, of training and unity prevailing against overwhelming odds. And yet, even in the wake of this repelled assault, an unspoken understanding lingered among the survivors. The battle was far from over. The ridge had been held, but the jungle had not finished revealing its lessons, and a new element, silent, unseen, and potentially decisive, was approaching, ready to test every assumption the men had relied upon. The decisive half-hour unfolded like a slow, measured clock, each minute carrying the weight of survival. The jungle compressed time and space into a relentless rhythm of observation, calculation, and action. Rifle reports echoed in bursts, punctuated by the dull thud of grenades and the muted impact of bayonets striking bodies. Every movement, every decision was magnified in the confined ridges, turning seconds into lifetimes for those caught in the maelstrom. Rangers rotated firing positions with seamless precision. Squads shifted quietly behind fallen logs and into shallow depressions, ensuring that a continuous line of fire stretched across the ridges without interruption. Every man understood his role, the arcs of his fire overlapping with his neighbor, creating a lattice of lethal coverage. It was a choreography born of training, reinforced by instinct, where even minor lapses could be fatal. The Japanese units, once cohesive in their aggressive advance, began to fragment under this relentless pressure. Ranks splintered as controlled volleys cut gaps into the formations, forcing soldiers to maneuver individually rather than collectively. Coordination, the backbone of their doctrine, dissolved under the concentrated, precise resistance. Whistles and shouted commands failed to restore cohesion, leaving isolated pockets vulnerable to interlocking fields of fire. Within this chaos, a cascade of micro-decisions determined the flow of battle. Each ranger assessed angles, adjusted fire, and chose positions that maximized effect, often in a matter of seconds. The enemy's mistakes, compounded by the dense terrain and compressed engagement, amplified these small choices. Each decision, minor on its own, compounded into a strategic advantage, reshaping the battlefield moment by moment. The discipline of the Ranger magnified their lethality. Where numbers should have dictated dominance, control and precision delivered devastation. Magazines were emptied only when necessary. Automatic fire was delivered in arcs that pinned, funneled, and fragmented the enemy. In the confined ridges, every shot was multiplied by the careful alignment of position, timing, and coordination. What might have been a single kill became a pattern, a line of resistance that the Japanese could neither predict nor penetrate. Bodies began to accumulate where the jungle funneled movement into narrow avenues. Fallen soldiers, both Japanese and American, became grim markers of the battle's rhythm, testament to the deadly precision that controlled the engagement. The terrain itself, once neutral, now amplified the Rangers' advantage, shaping the flow of men and fire with a silent, impartial hand. The ridges and hollows became instruments of survival, their contours exploited by those who understood their utility and hazards. By the end of those 30 minutes, the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The Japanese, though still formidable, had lost the cohesion and initiative that had defined their advance. The Rangers, disciplined and coordinated, held the decisive positions, their line intact, their fire methodical and unbroken. The half-hour had distilled the battle into its essential elements: preparation, clarity, and the disciplined application of skill. In the smoke-filled ridges of Leyte, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It had been forged in 30 minutes of controlled, unyielding resolve. And yet, even as the Rangers exhaled through the brief lull, the jungle seemed to whisper of new challenges ahead, as though the battle had only revealed the first act of a larger, unfolding drama, one that would test every assumption, every skill, and every ounce of courage they had drawn upon. After hours of relentless pressure, the Rangers finally sensed a shift. The Japanese advance, once unbroken and overwhelming, began to falter. Individual pockets hesitated, formations wavered, and the rhythm of their assault slowed under the cumulative weight of disciplined fire. Minute observations, whispered reports, and subtle gestures from officers revealed a truth long hoped for but not yet dared to declare. The encirclement was weakening. Commanders seized the moment with measured precision. Orders flowed silently down the ridgeline, conveyed through hand signals and brief, calm shouts. Squads pivoted, reoriented, and prepared to exploit the opening that had emerged. The maneuver was deliberate, a coordinated counterstroke that leveraged the discipline, training, and cohesion that had preserved the line through the previous hours of chaos. Every man understood his role. Every weapon was aimed, ready, and synchronized. Suppressed Japanese pockets began to dissolve under concentrated fire. The overlapping arcs of the Rangers' rifles and bars created lethal zones that left no opportunity for regrouping. Small groups attempting to advance found themselves trapped between intersecting lines of fire, their momentum crushed by the precision and patience of defenders who had spent hours mastering the ridges and choke points. The encirclement that had once seemed inescapable began to fragment, its cohesion eroded by discipline and acute observation. Through a narrow saddle along the ridge, a path finally opened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the smallest gap in a defensive web that had held under extreme pressure. Officers signaled for the wounded to be brought forward first, and stretcher teams navigated the treacherous incline with careful, deliberate steps. Each movement was measured, balancing urgency against the risk of exposure. The Rangers' withdrawal was not a retreat. It was an extraction, a disciplined exploitation of the fleeting advantage now visible in the enemy's line. Carrying the wounded, the men advanced along the path, every footfall deliberate. The ridges that had compressed the battle now guided them to safety. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but morale remained intact, sustained by the quiet knowledge that the enemy's momentum had finally been broken. Those who had survived the previous waves, the ambushes, and the close-quarters engagements now bore the burden of their comrades and the responsibility of preserving the hard-won position. Japanese survivors made no further organized attempt to pursue. Scattered soldiers emerged from cover, cautious and wary, but the momentum of the assault had been irreversibly lost. Doctrine and aggression could no longer compensate for the losses sustained under concentrated, disciplined fire. The ridge, once a crucible of pressure and fear, now held the exhausted victors in relative calm. The immediate danger reduced, but the cost painfully visible in the bodies, smoke, and shattered vegetation that lined the path. The battle ended not with triumph, not with cheers or fanfare, but with quiet astonishment. Survivors surveyed the ridge, counting the wounded, noting the gaps in the enemy line, and reflecting on the precariousness of what had been achieved. Victory was measured not in conquest or capture, but in survival, in the ability to endure, adapt, and execute under conditions that would have broken lesser formations. The men had faced an encirclement that promised annihilation and emerged intact, their discipline, skill, and quiet courage having written the final lines of this grueling chapter. Yet even in this stillness, a sense lingered that the battle had revealed only part of the war's cruel calculus, and that survival, once achieved, was only a prelude to the trials yet to come. As the echoes of gunfire faded into the humid stillness of the Leyte jungle, American medics moved swiftly among the ridges. Their hands were steady despite the exhaustion, patching wounds, stabilizing the gravely injured, and guiding stretcher teams through the uneven terrain. Each action was deliberate, a quiet defiance of the chaos that had defined the last hours. The wounded were lifted with care, their survival dependent on skill, not luck, in a landscape that had tested every ounce of human endurance. Reports of casualties traveled back through the ranks. The numbers were startling, shockingly low given the intensity of the Japanese assault and the overwhelming odds they had faced. Less than a dozen Rangers lay incapacitated, the majority of men still ready to fight if necessary. The line, battered but intact, bore silent testimony to the effectiveness of preparation, discipline, and cohesion under fire. Even amidst the sweat, grime, and exhaustion, a restrained pride rippled through the survivors. Across the battlefield, the cost to the Japanese was far heavier. Estimates later confirmed that over 500 soldiers had fallen in the engagement, a devastating toll for a single, concentrated push along narrow ridges. The weight of that loss, measured in men who would never advance again, underscored the lethal precision with which the Rangers had met their advance. Bodies, still warm in some places, marked the contours of the jungle, visual evidence of a disciplined defense that had bent the battlefield to its will. Survivors struggled to comprehend how just 120 men had held their ground against what should have been an unstoppable force. The question was repeated in hushed tones as they navigated the smoke-filled ridges. How could such a small contingent withstand a numerically superior opponent without collapse? The answer was not in courage alone, but in the orchestration of skill, timing, and understanding of terrain. Each rifleman, each squad, had played a role in a larger, calculated whole. Analysts later traced the success to three interwoven factors. Discipline ensured that fire was delivered deliberately, every volley counted, every movement precise. The terrain amplified those efforts, funneling the Japanese into predictable paths and amplifying the Rangers' defensive reach. And timing, minute, conscious, and responsive, allowed the Americans to exploit even the slightest hesitation in the enemy advance. It was the combination of these elements that transformed an unlikely defense into a tactical triumph. Yet the men who had lived through it grappled with more than strategy. They wrestled with the emotional weight of survival, the quiet astonishment at having endured where others had fallen, the shock at the devastation wrought on the enemy, and the haunting knowledge of how narrowly lives had been spared. Relief was tempered by gravity. Survival was neither celebration nor triumph, but the recognition of what had been risked and preserved. From the ridges of Leyte emerged a lesson as enduring as it was humbling. Wars do not turn on sheer numbers alone. Decisions, made in moments of pressure, guided by preparation, clarity, and understanding of the ground beneath one's feet, carry consequences far beyond immediate perception. In the silence that followed the engagement, the men of the 77th Rangers had lived through a truth as old as combat itself. That strategy, judgment, and discipline can bend even overwhelming odds to human will. The ridgelines and narrow hollows of Leyte had, in a matter of hours, become a proving ground for the principles of asymmetric warfare. The battle's narrative was written not in grand maneuvers or sweeping flanks, but in micro-decisions executed under pressure, in the precise timing of volleys, and in the disciplined restraint of small, cohesive units. Here, a handful of men could bend the battlefield to their will, proving that scale alone did not dictate outcome. The engagement laid bare the limitations of numerical advantage in terrain that refused to accommodate mass. The Japanese, trained to overwhelm with sheer numbers and momentum, found themselves funneled into narrow paths where every step was measured, every movement predictable. Where doctrine had promised dominance, the jungle imposed constraint, reducing the efficacy of superior force and magnifying the influence of observation, positioning, and disciplined fire. Fire discipline emerged as the defining factor. Semi-automatic rifles, bars, and careful coordination allowed the Rangers to exact devastation from positions that would have been meaningless without restraint. Each shot was deliberate, every volley synchronized with a neighbor's, and the resulting fields of fire turned simple geography into a force multiplier. Precision, patience, and timing proved more lethal than the uncoordinated application of overwhelming power. The psychology of leadership became equally critical. Commanders who maintained clarity under fire, those who issued orders with measured calm, who conveyed intent through gestures and example, created stability in a situation that threatened chaos. The jungle tested not only skill but nerves. Men who could act decisively without panic ensured cohesion, while hesitation elsewhere could have been catastrophic. This subtle influence of leadership proved as decisive as bullets or bayonets in determining survival. In the years that followed, Ranger training programs integrated these lessons, codifying the knowledge of terrain exploitation, fire discipline, and adaptive command. Doctrines evolved to emphasize small unit initiative, continuous situational awareness, and the ability to convert environmental constraints into tactical advantages. The ridge line at Leyte became a touchstone, a case study in how preparation and controlled response could overcome overwhelming odds. Japanese post-action reports reflected a different reckoning. Officers grappled with misjudgments rooted in rigidity, overconfidence, and reliance on numbers alone. Their analysis emphasized the cost of failing to adapt to compressed terrain and disciplined resistance, highlighting the psychological and tactical limitations revealed by a force they had assumed would be crushed with momentum alone. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that doctrine, when applied without adaptation, could be fatal. And throughout it all, the jungle remained silent, indifferent, yet omniscient. Its ridges, hollows, and dense canopies bore witness to the consequences of belief, discipline, and choice. Every fallen soldier, every line held or lost became part of its memory. The lessons of Leyte were not only tactical, they were moral and psychological, etched into both men and landscape, a reminder that in war, as in nature, persistence and clarity often outweigh scale and assumption. The battle ended, yet the jungle retained its quiet testimony. It whispered of preparation and hubris alike, a silent arbiter of consequence and a subtle prelude to the next moment when human judgment would collide with the immutable weight of terrain. Decades later, veterans of the Leyte Ridge would speak of the engagement with measured astonishment. For them, it was less a tale of heroics than of improbability. 120 men, pressed to the edge by overwhelming numbers, had endured where collapse seemed inevitable. Memories were etched not only in the scars of battle, but in the quiet understanding that their survival had defied expectation, born of discipline, preparation, and the stubborn clarity of judgment under fire. Historians tracing the legacy of Leyte would note its echoes across the Pacific theater. The principles demonstrated there, small unit initiative, fire discipline, terrain exploitation, would inform strategies in Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and beyond. Military analysts highlighted how constraints imposed by geography, when combined with resolute training, could invert the calculus of superiority. The engagement became a reference point, a benchmark of how preparation and intellect could triumph over brute force. The Japanese, in their post-action accounts, did not misread the weapons of the Americans. Their error lay in underestimating the minds controlling them. Riflemen, squad leaders, and officers acted with a composure and foresight that transformed simple rifles and machine guns into instruments of strategic precision. Numbers alone could not account for such ingenuity. Momentum and doctrine collapsed when faced with coordinated, adaptive, and disciplined opposition. For the Rangers, the battle crystallized into a symbol of controlled defiance. Each man's restraint, each calculated decision, had accumulated into a collective achievement that exceeded any individual effort. Survival was not luck, but a testament to understanding the terrain, respecting the enemy, and adhering to the principles drilled into them during campaigns far from the Philippines. Their stand became emblematic of how human intellect and training could shape the outcome of even the most dire circumstances. Leyte challenged assumptions about strength, courage, and calculation. Where numerical superiority might have suggested inevitability, the engagement revealed that courage alone could not secure victory, nor sheer force. Instead, it was the measured, disciplined application of knowledge, combined with the moral and psychological steadiness to act decisively in moments of extreme stress, that defined the outcome. The ridge lines and narrow hollows became silent arbiters, impartial yet decisive in awarding advantage to those who adapted with insight rather than weight. What began as an encirclement, a situation designed to crush and humiliate, ended as a reversal of belief. The Japanese, expecting submission under pressure, instead confronted a line that refused to yield, whose precision and cohesion turned anticipation into disarray. The moment reshaped their understanding of combat, of strategy, and of the consequences of underestimating a disciplined opponent. They thought 120 men were trapped. Instead, they discovered who was truly surrounded.